Somewhere in the distance, drums began to beat, the ancient rhythm of war, but this was not the frenzied beating of battle drums. It was the measured, ceremonial rhythm that had once summoned mossy warriors to defend their homeland against foreign invaders. The drummers were children of the Drummakers Guild, young people who had learned these rhythms from their fathers and grandfathers, who understood that each beat carried not just sound, but spiritual power. The drums were carved from trees sacred to mossy tradition, baobab and shea trees that had witnessed centuries of African history. The drumheads were made from the hide of cattle raised on the sacred plains around Tenkodogo, blessed by traditional priests and treated with herbs that were said to give the drums voices that could speak to both the living and the ancestors. When these drums spoke, every Mosi heart recognized the call, even those who had been born in cities far from the traditional homeland. Rodriguez realized this mission was slipping out of control. His years of military experience had taught him to read the dynamics of civilian populations under stress, to distinguish between controllable crowds and spontaneous uprisings that took on a life of their own. What he was witnessing fell into neither category. This was something for which his training had not prepared him. The captain was a veteran of 3 deployments, a professional soldier who had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mali. He had seen crowds driven by anger, by fear, by religious extremism, by economic desperation. He had learned to identify the leaders, to understand the pressure points, to predict when a crowd would disperse and when it would turn violent. But the crowd gathering outside the palace operated by different rules. Driven by forces he could not categorize or counter, bare feet slapped hot asphalt as more citizens surged toward the palace from every direction. The sound was like rainfall on a tin roof, except it grew steadily louder instead of fading. Rodriguez could track the crowd's growth through audio alone, the multiplication of footsteps, the layering of voices, the increasing complexity of the songs being sung. His perimeter was being tested not by organized assault, but by the simple weight of human bodies drawn by something stronger than military deterrence. The crowd's composition defied every assumption in his operational briefing. These were not unemployed young men with nothing to lose, the typical demographic for civil unrest. These were people who had abandoned their daily responsibilities, mothers with businesses to run, fathers with jobs to get to, students with classes to attend. They had made conscious decisions to sacrifice their immediate self-interest for something larger, something his military psychology training had not equipped him to understand. Mama Fatou, a weathered vendor with silver hair that had witnessed 60 years of African independence, led a column of women banging wooden spoons against pots like drums of war. Her voice cracked as she shouted war songs once raised against the French, melodies that had been sung by her grandmother during the resistance movements of the 1920s and 1930s, when Africans first began to organize against colonial rule. Mama Fatou's story was written in the lines of her face, the scar above her left eye from a French policeman's baton during a protest in 1958, the weathered hands that had sewn independence flags in secret meetings, the back bent from decades of carrying heavy loads to feed her family. She had raised 7 children, put 3 through university, and buried 2 who died in wars that had nothing to do with African interests. Her presence in the crowd was not political theater, but lived experience demanding recognition. "They killed Sankara," she sang, her voice rising above the cacophony. "They killed Lumumba. They killed Nkrumah's dream, but they cannot kill the spirit of Africa." The women around her took up the refrain, their voices creating harmonies that had never been written down but passed from mother to daughter through generations of struggle. Behind her, students in torn jeans locked arms, their faces burning with determination that came from years of studying the history they were now living. These were young people who had read Frantz Fanon and Walter Rodney, who had written thesis papers on structural adjustment programs and resource extraction, who understood exactly what was at stake in the confrontation unfolding before them. Aminata Coulibaly, the computer science student who had been uploading videos to secure servers, found herself standing next to Burema Sawadago, the independence veteran with his baobab walking stick. The 70-year age gap between them represented the full span of Burkina Faso's post-colonial history. But in this moment, they were united by a shared understanding that some principles were worth dying for. "Grandmother," Aminata said to Mama Fatou, using the respectful term for an elder, "teach us the songs." She wanted to document everything, but she also wanted to participate, to be part of the resistance rather than just recording it. Her smartphone captured the lyrics and melodies that would soon spread across social media, carrying the spirit of Ouagadougou to diaspora communities worldwide. Motorcycle taxi drivers abandoned their bikes to join the flood of bodies rushing forward, leaving their vehicles parked haphazardly along the roads leading to the palace. These were men who made their living navigating the chaotic traffic of African cities, who understood intimately the economic pressures facing ordinary Burkinabe families. Their presence in the crowd represented a conscious choice to prioritize dignity over daily earnings. Seydou Ouedraogo, a taxi driver who had been working since dawn to earn enough money to buy medicine for his sick daughter, turned off his engine when he heard the news on the radio. "They want to arrest our president for demanding fair prices for our gold and lithium," he told his passenger, a businessman who had been trying to get to a meeting with Chinese investors. "I cannot drive while my president is surrounded by foreign soldiers." The businessman, initially annoyed by the delay, found himself agreeing. "You are right, my brother. Some things are more important than business meetings." He paid his fare and joined Seydou in walking toward the palace, two strangers united by a moment that transcended their individual concerns. Acrid smoke from burning tires rose as barricades appeared across the streets leading to the palace. But these were not aggressive barriers designed to trap the American forces. They were symbolic statements, markers declaring that this was African soil under African control. The tires being burned were old and worn, useless for transportation but perfect for creating the black smoke that had become a symbol of resistance across Africa. The barricades were built and maintained by teenagers who had learned from their older siblings about the tactics of protest. They arranged the burning tires carefully, ensuring that the smoke would be visible from the helicopters overhead while keeping escape routes open for civilians. These young people had grown up watching revolutions streamed live on their phones. They understood both the symbolic and practical requirements of resistance in the digital age. But it was the children who broke Rodriguez's resolve, shattering his professional composure in ways that enemy fire had never managed. 7-year-old Amadi clutched his little sister's hand as they pushed through adult legs to reach the palace gates. His school uniform was torn from the rush, but his eyes blazed with purpose beyond his years, the moral clarity that children possess before they learn to compromise their principles for practical concerns. Amadi's sister Awa was only 5, old enough to sense the importance of what was happening but too young to understand the political complexities. She clutched a small doll made from traditional cloth, a toy that had been in their family for generations. The doll wore a miniature version of traditional Mossi royal clothing, complete with the geometric patterns that encoded spiritual and historical information about their people. When Amadi saw the American soldiers, he didn't run or hide behind his sister. Instead, he sat down in the red dust, crossed his legs in the posture he had learned for school prayers, and began to sing. His voice was high and clear, cutting through the chaos like a blade of pure sound. The song he chose was one he had learned from his grandmother, a lullaby about the baobab tree that protects all who shelter beneath its branches. His high, clear voice cut through the chaos like a blade of righteousness. Other children joined him, their innocent faces lifted toward heavily armed men who suddenly couldn't meet their gaze. These weren't combatants or protesters in any sense that military doctrine recognized. They were babies defending their home with nothing but courage and the unconscious moral authority that children possess when they act without calculation or fear. The sight of children singing in front of armored vehicles created an image that would be shared millions of times across social media, becoming one of the defining photographs of the 21st century. But for the soldiers who witnessed it firsthand, the impact was visceral and immediate, a confrontation with the moral implications of their mission that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Sergeant Williams knelt behind his rifle, hands trembling as he watched the scene unfold. The boy reminded him of his nephew back in Michigan. Same age, same fearless curiosity about the world, same unconscious assumption that adults existed to protect rather than threaten children. How could he explain to his sister that he had pointed a weapon at someone's child? How could he explain it to himself? Williams was 23 years old, barely an adult himself. He had joined the military to pay for college, following a path taken by millions of working-class Americans who saw military service as their ticket to economic mobility. He had believed the recruiting promises about serving his country and spreading democracy. Now, watching children sing songs of resistance in a language he didn't understand, he began to question everything he had been told about America's role in the world. The crowd's composition revealed the depth of Burkina Faso's unity across lines that typically divided African societies. Construction workers in hard hats stood beside traditional healers in flowing robes, their occupation separated by centuries of technological development, but united in their determination to defend their sovereignty. Bank executives in pressed suits marched alongside farmers still carrying hoes from morning work, their economic interests theoretically opposed but aligned in this moment of national testing. Even more remarkable was the religious unity on display. Teenage girls in hijabs linked arms with Christian grandmothers clutching rosaries, their theological differences set aside in favor of shared resistance to foreign domination. Imam Sawadago stood beside Pastor Ouedraogo. Religious leaders who had sometimes disagreed on social issues but found common ground in their commitment to Burkina Faso's independence. This religious cooperation was particularly significant in a region where interfaith tensions had been exploited by extremist groups seeking to divide and conquer local populations. The image of Muslim and Christian leaders standing together sent a powerful message that Burkina Faso's people would not be divided by external manipulation, that their unity was stronger than the sectarian conflicts that had torn apart other African nations. Street children, usually invisible to official notice, crept out from hiding to add their small voices to the roar. These were children who lived in the shadows of African cities, surviving through informal networks of mutual support, often dismissed as problems to be solved rather than citizens with rights to be protected. Their presence in the crowd was both touching and politically significant. Even the most marginalized members of society were willing to risk the little security they possessed for the possibility of genuine change. Rodriguez scanned through his scope, watching the gathering swell beyond anything his intelligence briefers had predicted. What had started as hundreds now surged into thousands, then tens of thousands. His radio hissed with frantic reports from each perimeter team, every access point blocked by human shields who showed no intention of dispersing. The reports coming through his earpiece painted a picture of a city in complete upheaval. Market areas that should have been busy with morning trade were empty as vendors joined the march to the palace. Schools that should have been conducting morning lessons were closed as teachers and students alike abandoned their regular routines. Government offices were unstaffed as civil servants chose to stand with their president rather than maintain administrative normalcy. Even more concerning from a military perspective was the disciplined nature of the crowd's organization. This was not a mob driven by emotion, despite the passionate singing and chanting. Student leaders coordinated different sections, religious leaders maintained calm among their followers, and community elders ensured that the youngest children were kept safe while still allowing them to participate. The crowd was large enough to overwhelm his forces but organized enough to avoid the chaos that would have justified forceful intervention. Elderly women in bright wraps knelt before his lead vehicle, hands clasped in prayer, eyes calm with the strength of mothers who had buried sons to war and refused to lose more to foreign command. These were women who had lived through every crisis in Burkina Faso's post-independence history, who had watched their country's wealth flow to foreign corporations while their own children struggled to afford education and health care. Salamata Compaoré, the market women's leader, positioned herself directly in front of the lead Humvee, her traditional cloth spread on the ground like a prayer mat. At 58, she had spent her entire adult life building the informal networks that kept Burkina Faso's economy functioning despite government instability and foreign interference. Her presence in front of an American armored vehicle was both an act of personal courage and a statement about the economic implications of the crisis. "I have 7 grandchildren," she called out to the soldiers in French, knowing that their translators would relay her words. "I want them to grow up in a country that controls its own destiny, that benefits from its own resources, that makes decisions based on African needs rather than foreign demands. If you want to arrest our president for fighting for our future, you must arrest all of us." Dr. Aminata Kone pushed through the crowd, her stethoscope still around her neck from the night shift at the National Hospital. She had delivered half the babies now sitting in the dust, had held the hands of dying elders who whispered stories of colonial resistance with their final breaths. These weren't faceless masses to her. They were her patients, her neighbors, her extended family in the African sense that recognizes kinship bonds extending far beyond blood relations. Dr. Kone's medical training gave her a unique perspective on the human cost of political decisions. She had treated children suffering from malnutrition, while their country's agricultural exports fed cattle in Europe. She had watched patients die from preventable diseases, while Burkina Faso's mineral wealth funded luxury lifestyles in Paris and London. The confrontation at the palace represented, for her, a chance to address the root causes of the suffering she witnessed daily in her medical practice. "You want our president?" she shouted toward the soldiers, her French accent thick with emotion that came from years of helplessly treating symptoms while the causes remained untouchable. "You, take him over our bodies. We are tired of watching our children die so that foreign corporations can profit from our gold." Her words carried across the crowd through the informal communication networks that had formed spontaneously. Translators repeated her statement in Muré, Dioula, and other local languages, ensuring that every member of the crowd understood not just what was being said, but why it mattered. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, a roar of approval that seemed to shake the ground beneath the American vehicles. Even the smallest children, usually invisible to daily political life, added their voices to the chorus of defiance. Rodriguez peered through his scope, watching the gathering swell beyond anything his operational planners had imagined possible. What had started as hundreds now surged into thousands, then tens of thousands, with more people arriving every minute from every direction. The children's participation was particularly powerful because it was entirely voluntary. No adult had forced them to join the protest. They had come because they sensed, with the intuitive wisdom that children possess, that something important was happening that would affect their futures. Their presence transformed a political confrontation into a defense of family, community, and the next generation's right to inherit a free homeland. The 7-Day Challenge. Extended Script. The first light of Ouagadougou's sun spread across the palace walls, casting them in a golden glow that seemed almost prophetic. The ground trembled as armored vehicles rolled in, their diesel engines shattering the quiet morning like a violent thunderclap across the Sahel. Dust swirled upward like angry spirits from the red earth while American Humvees locked the compound in tight formation, their tactical precision a stark contrast to the organic chaos of the awakening African city. Captain Rodriguez adjusted his vest, sweat already sliding down his face despite the early hour. The weight of his equipment felt heavier than usual, as if the gravity of this mission pressed down on him with supernatural force. Through his binoculars, the flag of Burkina Faso still waved proudly above the palace, its red, white, and green, standing firm against the pale sky like a defiant gesture against the iron-gray armor surrounding it. The red stripe represented the revolution that had given birth to this nation. The white symbolized peace, now shattered by foreign boots on sovereign soil. The green embodied hope, the same hope that had carried Thomas Sankara's vision of African dignity into the 21st century. Rodriguez had studied the symbolism in his briefings, but seeing it now, rippling in the morning breeze as his forces prepared to arrest its protector, made his stomach churn with unexpected unease. The chopping of helicopter blades tore through the air like metal birds of prey circling wounded game. Apache gunships maintained overwatch while transport helicopters ferried additional troops from the American base in neighboring Niger. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who had lived through decades of Western military interventions across the Sahel, the mechanical heartbeat of foreign power imposing its will on African soil. Local vendors who had just begun to set out mangoes and fabric scattered in panic, their morning routines shattered by the sudden appearance of a war zone in their neighborhood. Mama Korotum, who had sold oranges at the same corner for 30 years, clutched her basket to her chest as she watched foreign soldiers deploy around the home of her president. Her weathered hands shook not with fear, but with rage at the familiar sight of white faces behind rifles telling Africans what to do. The old baobab tree that had guarded this ground for centuries leaned as if shielding the palace, its massive trunk scarred by decades of political upheaval. Local legend claimed the tree had been planted by a mossy king who prophesied that foreign invaders would one day return, but that the tree would outlive them all. Its twisted branches seemed to reach protectively over the palace compound, ancient wisdom offering what shelter it could against modern aggression. Inside the palace, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window of his private office, his reflection faint against the bulletproof glass installed after 3 previous coup attempts. His hands stayed steady as he watched the soldiers tighten their grip on his home, but his mind raced through the implications of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just an arrest warrant being served. This was the latest chapter in a centuries-old story of Africa's resources being claimed by foreign powers through the barrel of a gun. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated photographs on his desk, his wife Assimi and their young children, Thomas Sankara during his brief, shining presidency, and Nelson Mandela walking free from prison. 3 images representing love, vision, and the possibility of triumph against impossible odds. Traoré's fingers traced the edge of Sankara's photograph, remembering the words that had inspired his own political awakening. He who feeds you controls you. His aide, Aminata Sawadogo, burst through the doors, her traditional head wrap tilted askew, breath short from the 3-story climb. The urgency in her movements spoke louder than words. This was not a drill, not a diplomatic protest, but the moment they had all feared would eventually come. "Mr. President, they demand your immediate surrender," she whispered, clutching a crackling radio alive with American voices speaking in the clipped, efficient tones of military professionals executing a precision operation. Traoré's jaw clenched at the tone, the same arrogance his ancestors had resisted for generations, the same dismissive certainty that had characterized French colonial administrators, World Bank officials, and International Monetary Fund negotiators. The assumption that African leaders existed only to receive orders from their Western betters, not to make independent decisions about their own nation's futures. The smell of breakfast tea lingered in the room, jasmine and mint mixed with honey, a sharp reminder of the calm morning so violently broken. The silver service had been a gift from the Moroccan king, and the porcelain cups bore the emblem of Burkina Faso, small symbols of sovereignty and dignity, now seeming fragile as paper against the armor assembled outside. Behind him, portraits of Thomas Sankara and other African heroes seemed to watch silently from the walls. Sankara in his iconic red beret, Patrice Lumumba speaking to the Congolese parliament, Kwame Nkrumah raising Ghana's flag at independence. Their eyes seemed to burn with questions. Would this generation of African leaders finally break the cycle of foreign domination? Or would Traoré become another cautionary tale about the price of African independence? A loudspeaker mounted on the lead vehicle came to life, the metallic voice echoing like thunder off the palace walls. "President Traoré, you have 30 minutes to surrender for immediate extradition to the United States." The demand, delivered in broken French by an American soldier who had clearly memorized the words phonetically, cut like an insult. Not a request, not a negotiation, an ultimatum delivered with the casual brutality of an empire that had never learned to ask rather than demand. What the American intelligence briefings hadn't prepared Rodriguez for was the speed at which word traveled through Ouagadougou's neighborhoods. This wasn't the rural Afghanistan or urban Iraq of his previous deployments, where information moved slowly through traditional networks. This was a modern African city where smartphones and social media could mobilize populations faster than any military could contain them. In the Sisson Quarter, known locally as the intellectual heart of the city due to its proximity to the university, Mama Kadi dropped her calabash of millet as her neighbor's radio crackled with news. The ceramic vessel shattered on the concrete courtyard, scattering grain like scattered hopes. Her weathered hands pressed against her chest as she processed the impossible. Foreign soldiers had surrounded their president's home like hunters cornering prey. Mama Kadi was 67 years old. She had been born during the final years of French colonial rule, had witnessed independence in 1960, lived through the military coups and counter-coups that followed, and had celebrated when Thomas Sankara briefly made Burkina Faso a beacon of African pride in the 1980s. She had wept when Sankara was assassinated, had endured the corrupt regimes that followed, and had dared to hope again when young Ibrahim Traoré spoke of completing Sankara's revolution. "Hey, they think we are still colonized," she shouted, her voice carrying across the narrow alleyways with the force of accumulated grievances spanning 7 decades. The cry was taken up by other voices, spreading from compound to compound like a fire jumping from roof to roof. Within minutes, every household in Sisson buzzed with urgent conversations conducted in Mooré, French, Dioula, and a dozen other languages that reflected Burkina Faso's complex ethnic tapestry. Mothers grabbed their children, not to flee but to explain what they were witnessing. These were women who had raised their babies on stories of resistance, who had sung lullabies about ancestors who fought colonial rule, who had taught their daughters that dignity was more valuable than safety. Now they faced the moment when those stories would be tested against modern reality. Fathers abandoned their morning prayers, streaming out of mosques and churches where they had been seeking divine guidance for their daily struggles. Imam Abdoulaye Sawadago, whose mosque served the eastern edge of Sisson, paused mid-prayer as he heard the sound of helicopters. His congregation, instead of dispersing, looked to him for leadership. "Allah tests the faithful," he said simply, "and today our faith is tested not by poverty or illness, but by foreign armies." Teenagers snatched up anything that could serve as a flag or banner. Traditional kente cloth, university pennants, even bedsheets painted hastily with the colors of Burkina Faso. These were young people who had grown up with smartphones and social media, who understood instinctively how to document history as it unfolded. Their phones were already live-streaming images of American military vehicles to TikTok, Instagram, and WhatsApp groups that connected them to peers across Africa and the diaspora. In the Tampuy district, home to the University of Ouagadougou's main campus, students checking morning news on cracked phone screens couldn't believe the headlines. The infrastructure might be underfunded, the dormitories overcrowded, the laboratories under-equipped, but the intellectual energy was undeniable. These were young Africans who had studied Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral alongside their economics and engineering textbooks. Fatoumata Sorgo, a 22-year-old political science major from a farming family in the north, stared at the live video streaming from the palace, Her hands shook as she showed her roommates the footage of tanks surrounding their leader. This was the girl who had walked 12 kilometers to school every day as a child, who had earned her university place through pure academic merit, who wrote her thesis on neo-colonial economic structures in post-independence Africa. "This is exactly what Professor Ouedraogo warned us about," she whispered to her roommates, referencing their course on neocolonialism taught by Dr. Rasmane Ouedraogo, a scholar who had been imprisoned twice for his critiques of French influence in West Africa. "They eliminate any African leader who refuses to bow. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. The pattern never changes." Her roommate, Aminata Coulibaly, studying computer science, was already uploading videos to a secure server network her boyfriend had set up for student activists. "Let them try to control the narrative this time," she muttered, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "We have the internet now. We have our own voices." Within 30 minutes, students were pouring out of dormitories, grabbing makeshift drums, traditional cloths, and anything bearing Burkina Faso's colors. The campus emptied as if responding to an ancient call to arms. But this was not mindless mob action. Student leaders organized groups by faculty, assigned communication responsibilities, and established rendezvous points. These were young intellectuals who understood both the historical significance and the tactical requirements of resistance. The university's political science department, led by Professor Ouedraogo, became an impromptu command center. Students with journalism training began documenting everything, while those studying international relations started reaching out to contacts in other African universities. The engineering students hacked into radio frequencies to coordinate with protesters across the city, while the literature students composed songs that would soon echo across the continent. At the palace gates, children from the nearby École Primaire de Koulouba pressed their faces against the iron bars, trying to understand why foreign soldiers surrounded their leader's home. These were children who attended a school named after Sankara's educational reforms, who learned African history alongside French colonial history, who had been taught that Africa's problems required African solutions. 8-year-old Yakuba Ouedraogo, son of a market vendor, whispered to his friend, "Why are white soldiers pointing guns at our president?" His friend Awa Traoré, daughter of a taxi driver, replied with the wisdom of a child raised on stories of resistance, "Because they don't want us to be free." Their teacher, Mariam Kabore, a young woman who had joined the education ministry specifically to implement Traoré's curriculum reforms, knelt down to explain what they were witnessing, while simultaneously live-streaming their conversation to show the world that this confrontation was taking place in front of children walking to school. Market women in bright wrappers arrived in increasing numbers, their early morning trade abandoned for something more important. These were the backbone of Burkina Faso's informal economy, women who sent their children to university through petty trading, who organized savings groups that funded community development projects, who had supported every genuine reform movement in the country's history because they understood that real change started at the grassroots level. Salamata Compaoré, president of the Ouagadougou Market Women's Association, had been awake since 4 a.m. preparing vegetable for the morning market. When news of the siege reached her through the market's informal communication network, she didn't hesitate. "Sisters," she called out across the market stalls, "they come for our president like they came for our ancestors. We know what to do." The market women's arrival brought with them songs of resistance passed down through generations. These were melodies that had once rallied fighters against French colonial forces, that had been sung during independence celebrations, that had been hummed as lullabies to children during the dark years of military dictatorship. Now they rose again, harmonizing with the sound of helicopter blades and diesel engines. From the mosque nearby, the call to prayer blended with the swelling chants of defiance. Imam Oumarou Diallo, a respected religious leader who had known both Sankara and Traoré personally, made a decision that would later be studied in seminaries across Africa. Instead of the traditional call to prayer, he used the mosque's loudspeaker to call the faithful to defend the house of their chosen leader with the same dedication they would defend the house of Allah. Even the stray dogs barked at the unfamiliar voices, their animal instincts sensing the tension that filled the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Rodriguez checked his watch, his voice tight as he relayed orders through his headset. The 30-minute deadline felt endless and impossibly short. Military time was precise, mechanical, controllable. African time was organic, communal, driven by consensus rather than command. Outside the gates, the crowd swelled beyond anything his intelligence briefings had predicted. Old men with walking sticks came forward, their faces carved by colonial scars and post-independence struggles. These were veterans of independence movements, men who had been young during the anti-colonial struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. They moved slowly but with unmistakable purpose, each step a testament to decades of experience in confronting foreign power. Burema Sawadago, 74 years old, had fought with the Voltaic resistance against French rule in his youth. His walking stick was carved from the same baobab tree under which he had first heard Thomas Sankara speak about African dignity. As he approached the American perimeter, he remembered the words Sankara had spoken that day. "You cannot kill ideas with bullets. You cannot colonize minds that know their own worth." Mothers lifted their babies high, a gesture that in Mossi culture represented both protection and defiance. They were showing their children to the foreign soldiers, making it clear that this was not an abstract political confrontation, but a defense of family, community, and future generations. The babies, too young to understand the politics, sensed their mother's determination and remained remarkably quiet, as if they too understood the gravity of the moment. The captain had been warned of resistance in his briefings, but nothing had prepared him for an entire people ready to stand between their leader and foreign guns. This wasn't the resistance he had faced in his previous deployments, angry young men with grievances and weapons. This was something far more dangerous to his mission, ordinary people with unshakable moral conviction, armed with nothing but their willingness to face death rather than accept humiliation. Inside the palace, while chaos built outside like a gathering storm, Traoré moved through corridors his predecessors had walked for generations. Each footstep echoed with the weight of history. As these halls had witnessed the rise and fall of colonial administrators, the brief flowering of independence, the dark years of military dictatorship, and now this moment of ultimate testing. The marble floors, polished to a mirror finish, reflected not just his image but seemed to hold the shadows of every leader who had faced impossible choices within these walls. The corridor was lined with portraits of Burkina Faso's complex history, French colonial governors with their stern faces and military decorations, independence leaders with their hopes for a free Africa, and the tragic gallery of presidents who had tried and failed to balance African dignity with global realities. As he made his way to the ancestral chamber, a room most visitors never saw, where the spiritual heart of Burkina Faso's leadership resided, Traoré felt the weight of thousands of years of African civilization pressing down on his shoulders. This was not just a political crisis, but a spiritual confrontation between two worldviews: the Western belief that power flowed from weapons and economic dominance, and the African understanding that true authority came from the sacred bond between leader and people. The ancestral chamber was located in the oldest part of the palace, built on foundations that predated European contact by centuries. The walls were constructed from laterite blocks quarried from the same hills where Mossi kings had ruled for 500 years before the first European explorer set foot in the region. The room itself was small, intimate, designed not for grand ceremonies but for the quiet communion between the living and the ancestral spirits who guided their decisions. Elder Yamba waited in the shadows, his bent frame draped in traditional kente cloth that seemed to absorb the dim candlelight like a black hole absorbing starlight. At 93, he was not merely old, but ancient, a living bridge between the pre-colonial kingdoms and the modern nation-state. His clouded eyes, nearly blind from cataracts, nevertheless tracked Traoré's entrance with supernatural precision, as if he saw not with his physical vision, but with some deeper form of perception. The elder's presence filled the room despite his small stature. He was the last living griot who had learned the oral traditions directly from men who remembered the colonial conquest, who could recite genealogies stretching back to the founding of the Mossi kingdoms, who carried in his memory the complete history of a people's resistance to foreign domination. His voice, when he spoke, carried not just his own authority but the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. "The spirits told me you would come," Yamba whispered, his voice like wind through dry leaves during the harmattan season. The words seemed to emanate not just from his throat but from the walls themselves, as if the palace had found its voice. "They have been restless all week," speaking of a great test approaching like storm clouds gathering on the horizon during the rainy season. The chamber walls bore ancient masks carved from ironwood, their hollow eyes watching like guardians from beyond the veil of death. Each mask represented a different aspect of Mossi spirituality: the warrior mask of Naba Wubri, the wisdom mask of Naba Ubri, the justice mask of Naba Zombre. These were not museum pieces but living spiritual entities, activated through centuries of ritual and reverence, ready to offer guidance to their descendant in his hour of need. Scattered across a low wooden table were the tools of divination that had guided Mossi leaders through countless crises: cowrie shells from the ancient trade routes that connected West Africa to the Mediterranean, fragments of meteorite that had fallen from the sky as signs from the ancestors, and leather pouches containing herbs whose names existed only in the old tongue and whose properties had been passed down through oral tradition for millennia. The air hung thick with frankincense imported from Sudan and the earthy smell of red clay from the sacred hills of Tenkodogo. Smoke from the burning incense created patterns in the air that Yamba read like text, interpreting the spiritual atmosphere as a meteorologist might read weather patterns. The scent carried memories of initiation ceremonies, of coronations, of moments when the Mossi people had faced existential threats and found strength in their spiritual traditions. "Your father came to this room before the revolution that never came," Yamba continued, lighting another candle with hands that shook not from age, but from the spiritual energy flowing through the chamber. "Your grandfather stood here when the French demanded his submission in 1896. Your great-grandfather knelt on this same mat when the first white explorers arrived, claiming they came in peace while their soldiers waited beyond the horizon. Traoré's father, Captain Thomas Sankara, no relation to the revolutionary president who bore the same name, had been a military officer who had dreamed of leading a coup to restore Mossi traditional authority. He had died in a car accident that many suspected was assassination, carried out by French intelligence services who feared any movement toward genuine African independence. His plans had died with him, but his son had inherited both his political awareness and his spiritual connection to Mossi traditions. Now, the Americans repeat the same arrogance," Yamba said, his voice carrying decades of accumulated anger, "thinking Africa will bend because their weapons are louder, their technology more advanced, their economy more powerful. They do not understand that there are forces in this world that cannot be conquered by material strength alone." Traoré knelt on the woven mat, feeling the weight of generations pressing down like a physical force. The mat itself was a relic. Woven by royal craftswomen from cotton grown in the sacred fields around Tenkodogo, dyed with indigo that had been traded across the Sahara for centuries, patterned with symbols that encoded the spiritual DNA of the Mossi people. Through the thick walls he could hear the distant rumble of approaching crowds, his people responding to a call deeper than politics or nationalism. The sound reached him not just as audio but as vibration, transmitted through the stone and mortar of the palace into his bones and blood. It was the sound of a people awakening, of a continent remembering its strength, of history itself shifting on its axis. He could distinguish individual elements, the songs of the market women, the chants of the students, the prayers of the religious leaders, but they blended into something larger, a symphony of resistance that made the helicopters overhead sound weak and mechanical by comparison. "Tell me what the ancestors see," he requested, his voice barely above a whisper. In Mossi tradition, the living were never alone in their decision-making. Every choice was made in consultation with the spirits of those who had gone before, whose wisdom had been tested by experience and whose love for their people transcended death itself. Yamba scattered the cowrie shells across the clay floor, their white surfaces catching candlelight like stars emerging in a darkening sky. The shells fell in patterns that he had learned to read as a child, taught by masters who had learned from their masters in an unbroken chain stretching back to the founding of the kingdoms. His fingers traced patterns in the dust as he muttered incantations in Muré, the language of the Mossi kings who had ruled these lands for 5 centuries before European colonialism attempted to erase their memory. The incantations were not mere superstition, but encoded wisdom. Philosophical and practical insights disguised as spiritual formulas. They contained instructions for everything from agricultural timing to military strategy, from diplomatic negotiations to economic planning. The ancestors had faced countless crises, and their accumulated wisdom was available to any leader humble enough to seek it and wise enough to interpret it correctly. "They see a crossroads," Yamba announced after long minutes of study, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy. The shells had fallen in a pattern he had seen only once before, during the night before Thomas Sankara's assassination, when the spiritual realm had vibrated with tension and possibility. "One path leads to surrender, and the slow death of our sovereignty, the withering of our people's spirit under the weight of foreign dominance." He paused, his eyes widening as if seeing visions beyond the physical realm that surrounded them. The candlelight flickered, though there was no wind in the sealed chamber, and the temperature seemed to drop despite the afternoon heat outside. These were signs that the ancestors were present, that the conversation was being witnessed by generations of leaders who had faced similar choices. "The other path." His voice trailed off as he studied the configuration of shells more closely, cross-referencing their positions with symbols carved into the wooden table centuries ago. "The other leads to a confrontation that will shake the foundations of how the world sees Africa. But the ancestors warn that this path requires courage beyond what any one man can muster alone. It requires the unity of an entire people, willing to risk everything for the possibility of true freedom." The old man reached into a leather pouch worn smooth by centuries of handling and withdrew an amulet that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. It was a piece of meteoric iron wrapped in gold thread, worn smooth by centuries of contact with human skin, heavy with the accumulated spiritual energy of every leader who had worn it during moments of crisis. "This fell from the sky the night your great-grandfather was born," Yamba explained, holding the amulet up to catch the candlelight. The court astronomers interpreted it as a sign that this child would one day face a test that would determine the fate of his entire people. It has guided our leaders through every crisis since the colonial wars, through the resistance against French occupation, through the struggle for independence, through the dark years of military dictatorship. As Traoré's fingers closed around the ancient metal, warmth spread through his palm like electricity, but also like the touch of a beloved ancestor's hand. The sensation was both physical and spiritual, a connection to every leader who had worn this amulet, who had faced impossible odds with nothing but faith in their people and trust in the wisdom of their ancestors. The iron itself was not of this world, literally star metal that had traveled across the cosmos before falling to Earth in the heart of Africa. In Mossi cosmology, this made it a bridge between the earthly and celestial realms, a conduit for communication with spiritual forces that existed beyond the physical plane. Wearing it was both an honor and a responsibility, a reminder that leadership was not about personal power, but about serving as a channel for collective wisdom and ancestral guidance. Outside, the chanting grew louder, voices blending in harmonies that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sound penetrated the thick walls of the ancestral chamber, carrying with it the hopes and fears of millions of Africans who had watched their leaders rise and fall, who had seen promise after promise broken by the intervention of foreign powers. The voices were singing in multiple languages, Muré, Dioula, French, Arabic, but the melody was universal, recognized by every African who had ever dreamed of true independence. It was the song that had been sung during the independence celebrations of the 1960s, that had echoed in the townships during the anti-apartheid struggle, that had risen from the streets of Tunis and Cairo during the Arab Spring. It was the sound of Africa remembering its power. Somewhere in the distance, drums began to beat, the ancient rhythm of war. Rodriguez realized this mission was slipping out of control. Bare feet slapped hot asphalt as more citizens surged toward the palace from every direction. Mama Fatou, a weathered vendor with silver hair, led women banging wooden spoons against pots like drums. Her voice cracked as she shouted war songs once raised against the French. Behind her, students in torn jeans locked arms, their faces burning with determination. Motorcycle taxi drivers abandoned their bikes to join the flood of bodies rushing forward. Acrid smoke from burning tires rose as barricades appeared across the streets. But it was the children who broke Rodriguez's resolve. 7-year-old Amadi clutched his little sister's hand as they pushed through adult legs to reach the palace gates. His school uniform was torn from the rush, but his eyes blazed with purpose beyond his years. When he saw the American soldiers, he didn't run. Instead, he sat down in the red dust, crossed his legs, and began to sing. His high, clear voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Other children joined him, their innocent faces lifted toward heavily armed men who suddenly couldn't meet their gaze. These weren't combatants or protesters. They were babies defending their home with nothing but courage. Sergeant Williams knelt behind his rifle, hands trembling as he watched the scene unfold. The boy reminded him of his nephew back in Michigan. Same age, same fearless curiosity about the world. How could he explain to his sister that he had pointed a weapon at someone's child? The crowd's composition revealed the depth of Burkina Faso's unity. Construction workers in hard hats stood beside traditional healers in flowing robes. Teenage girls in hijabs linked arms with Christian grandmothers clutching rosaries. Bank executives in pressed suits marched alongside farmers still carrying hoes from morning work. Even street children crept out from hiding, adding small voices to the roar. Rodriguez scanned through his scope. The crowd, now thousands strong, far beyond projections. His radio sparked with urgent reports, unarmed civilians blocking every access point. Elderly women in bright wraps knelt before his lead vehicle, hands clasped in prayer, eyes calm with the strength of mothers who had buried sons to war and refused to lose more to foreign command. Dr. Aminata Kone pushed through the crowd, her stethoscope still around her neck from the night shift at the National Hospital. She had delivered half the babies now sitting in the dust, had held the hands of dying elders who whispered stories of colonial resistance. These weren't faceless masses. They were her patients, her neighbors, her family. "You want our president?" she shouted toward the soldiers, her French accent thick with emotion. "You take him over our bodies." Even the smallest children, usually invisible to daily life, added their voices to the chorus of defiance. Rodriguez peered through his scope, watching the gathering swell beyond anything he had been told to expect. What had started as hundreds now surged into thousands. His radio hissed with frantic reports from each perimeter team, every access point blocked by human shields. While Ouagadougou erupted in defiance, the ripple effects spread across continents like shock waves from an earthquake, traveling at the speed of fiber optic cables and satellite transmissions. The digital age had compressed time and space in ways that made this crisis fundamentally different from previous confrontations between African leaders and Western powers. Where once news of such events might have taken days or weeks to reach distant capitals, now the entire world was watching in real time. In Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, President Alassane Ouattara's emergency session was interrupted by aides rushing in with tablet screens showing live feeds from Burkina Faso. The irony of the moment was not lost on anyone in the room. Ouattara owed his own presidency partly to Western intervention during the 2010-2011 post-election crisis, when French and UN forces had helped remove his predecessor, Laurent Gbagbo. Now he watched a neighboring leader resist the same forces that had once enabled his rise to power. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, watching thousands of unarmed civilians facing down American armor in broad daylight. The French phrase came naturally to a man educated in Philadelphia and Paris who had spent decades working for the International Monetary Fund before returning to Ivorian politics. But the shock in his voice was purely African. The recognition of a leader who understood that what was happening in Ouagadougou could happen anywhere on the continent. The president's advisors exchanged worried glances as they processed the implications. If American forces could surround one African president with tanks, what prevented them from doing the same to any leader who challenged Western interests? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning every assumption about sovereignty and international law that had supposedly governed relations between Africa and the West since independence. Ouattara's foreign minister, Kandia Kamara, voiced what everyone was thinking. If they can do this to Ibrahim, they can do it to any of us. The only question is who will be next. Her words carried the weight of a continent's accumulated fears about neo-colonial interference, about the limits of independence in a world where military and economic power remained concentrated in the hands of former colonial masters. The ECOWAS emergency session convened via secure video link within 2 hours, but the technology that enabled rapid communication also exposed the divisions within African leadership. 15 West African leaders stared at screens showing a crisis none had anticipated, their responses revealing the complex calculations that governed African politics in the 21st century. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo spoke first, his voice heavy with implications they all understood but rarely articulated so directly. If they can surround Ibrahim in broad daylight, broadcasting it live to the world, which of us is safe? Today, it's Burkina Faso. Tomorrow, it could be any of us who dare to think independently about our resources, our alliances, our development models. His words carried particular weight because Ghana had been attempting to assert greater control over its gold mining industry, renegotiating contracts with multinational corporations to ensure more revenue stayed in the country. The timing of the crisis in Burkina Faso, coming just weeks after Ghana's announcement of new mining regulations, seemed too convenient to be coincidental. President Macky Sall of Senegal, participating from his palace in Dakar, expressed the dilemma facing every African leader. We are caught between our people's expectations and international pressures. Our citizens demand sovereignty and dignity, but our economies depend on relationships with powers that view our independence as negotiable. The video conference revealed the generational and ideological divides within African leadership. Older presidents who had lived through the independence era were more sympathetic to Traoré's position, while younger leaders who had come of age during the era of structural adjustment were more cautious about confronting Western power directly. In Lagos, Nigeria's political elite gathered in the presidential villa, watching Al Jazeera's continuous coverage on multiple screens while aides provided updates from social media and diplomatic channels. President Bola Tinubu had survived decades of Nigerian politics by reading power dynamics others missed, by understanding when to fight and when to accommodate. What he saw in Ouagadougou terrified him. Not the American show of force, but the unified response of ordinary Africans. They're not protesting for Traoré specifically, he told his advisors, his analysis cutting through the emotional reactions that dominated media coverage. They're protesting for themselves, for the idea that Africa can choose its own path without permission from Washington, Paris, or London. This is bigger than one president or one country. Tinubu's insight was shaped by his experience as governor of Lagos, where he had learned to read the mood of Africa's largest city, to understand when popular anger was reaching boiling point. The images from Ouagadougou showed the same energy he had seen during Nigeria's Sheikh Ensar's protests, the same willingness to risk everything for dignity and change. His phone buzzed with calls from Western embassies, each offering their version of events, each minimizing the sovereignty violations with carefully crafted diplomatic language. The American ambassador stressed terrorism concerns and regional security partnerships. The French ambassador emphasized the need for stability and existing defense agreements. The British High Commissioner spoke about democratic values and the rule of law. Tinubu ignored them all. Instead, he ordered his communications team to draft a statement that would echo across the continent, one that positioned Nigeria firmly on the side of African sovereignty without directly challenging American power. The careful balance required in such statements reflected the complex realities facing African leaders in a multipolar world where old certainties no longer applied. Meanwhile, in Kampala, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, a veteran of liberation struggles who had been in power for nearly 4 decades, watched the footage with grim satisfaction. At 79, he was one of the few African leaders who remembered the early days of independence, who had participated in guerrilla warfare against colonial and post-colonial regimes. "This is how revolution begins," he told his inner circle, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through multiple cycles of African resistance and accommodation. Not with bullets fired in anger, but with people who refused to be afraid of the consequences of their courage. Museveni's analysis was informed by his experience as a young revolutionary in the 1960s and 1970s, when he had fought alongside other liberation movements across Eastern and Southern Africa. The sight of African people choosing courage over safety reminded him of his own guerrilla days, when small bands of fighters had faced seemingly impossible odds against better-equipped opponents. His foreign minister, J.J. Odongo, raised practical concerns about Uganda's own relationships with Western powers. "Your Excellency, we have significant military cooperation agreements with the United States. Our position on this crisis could affect those relationships." Museveni's response was characteristic of a leader who had learned to balance principle with pragmatism. "Let them learn that African dignity is not negotiable. We can cooperate with anyone who respects our sovereignty, but we will not bow to those who point guns at our colleagues." Across Africa, the pattern repeated with variations that reflected each country's unique history and circumstances. In Dar es Salaam, Tanzanian workers abandoned their posts to crowd around television screens in electronics shops, their spontaneous gatherings growing into impromptu solidarity demonstrations. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopian students marched to the American embassy with signs reading "Hands Off Africa" in Amharic, English, and Arabic. In Johannesburg, taxi drivers, the backbone of South Africa's informal transportation system, refused fares to the U.S. consulate, their speakers blasting solidarity songs that mixed traditional African melodies with contemporary hip-hop beats. The gesture was both practical protest and symbolic statement. American diplomats would have to find other ways to move around the city while their government pointed guns at an African president. The diaspora responded even more dramatically, driven by the complex emotions of Africans living in the countries whose governments were threatening their homeland. In Paris, where thousands of West Africans lived in crowded suburbs like Seine-Saint-Denis and Val-de-Marne, entire neighborhoods emptied onto the streets within hours of the news breaking. The march toward the Champs-Élysées was organized through WhatsApp groups and social media networks that connected African communities across France. Participants carried Burkina Faso flags alongside signs in French, Arabic, and local languages that many had never forgotten, despite decades of assimilation pressure. The demonstration represented multiple generations of African migration: elderly men who had come as guest workers in the 1960s, their children who had grown up French but never lost their African identity, and recent immigrants who still carried fresh memories of the homeland. Mamadou Diallo, a retired construction worker who had spent 40 years building Paris while sending money home to Mali, carried a photograph of Thomas Sankara alongside the current Burkina Faso flag. "They killed Sankara for the same reason they want to arrest Traoré," he explained to a French television reporter, "because he refused to let foreigners steal African resources while African children go hungry." In London's Peckham district, Ghanaian and Nigerian communities organized within hours through networks that had been built over decades of immigration and settlement. Sister Akosua, a church leader who had lived in London for 30 years while maintaining strong ties to Ghana, stood before her congregation with tears streaming down her face. "Our children born here ask us why we left Africa," she declared to the packed church, her voice carrying the pain of displacement and the hope of eventual return. "They see only poverty and conflict on the news, only negative images of our homeland. Today we show them there are Africans who never left, who stayed to fight for our continent's dignity, who risk everything so that Africa can stand equal with any nation on earth." The congregation's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, they had organized a march from Peckham to the U.S. Embassy in Grosvenor Square, their route taking them through neighborhoods where other African communities joined their ranks. By the time they reached central London, the demonstration included Somalis from Tower Hamlets, Nigerians from Southwark, and Zimbabweans from across the city. Similar scenes played out in New York, where African diaspora communities gathered in Harlem and the Bronx before marching to the United Nations headquarters. The symbolism was deliberate. The UN building represented the international system that was supposed to protect small nations from great power interference, but which had repeatedly failed to prevent such interventions when Western interests were at stake. Dr. Aisha Nyong, a Cameroonian professor at Columbia University who had spent years studying neo-colonialism in Africa, addressed the crowd gathered outside the UN. "What we are witnessing in Burkina Faso is not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that stretches back to independence. Every African leader who has tried to control their country's resources, who has prioritized African development over Western profit, has faced the same treatment." Her analysis resonated with demonstrators who had lived experience of the dynamics she described. Many had left Africa not because they wanted to, but because economic policies imposed by international financial institutions had made it impossible to build sustainable livelihoods at home. The confrontation in Ouagadougou represented for them a chance for Africa to break free from those constraints. In Washington, D.C., the epicenter of the crisis, African diaspora communities faced the complex challenge of protesting against their adopted country's foreign policy while maintaining their status as residents and citizens. The demonstration outside the White House was smaller but more poignant, featuring second- and third-generation African Americans alongside recent immigrants from across the continent. Marcus Johnson, whose great-grandfather had been brought to America as a slave, stood beside Fatima Kamara, who had arrived from Sierra Leone just 5 years earlier. Despite their different histories, they shared a common understanding of what was at stake in Burkina Faso: the right of African people to determine their own destiny without interference from powers that had historically exploited their labor and resources. Africa's heartbeat synchronized around one moment of defiance, but the rhythm was complex, reflecting the continent's diversity while affirming its fundamental unity. From Cape Town to Cairo, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people who had never heard of Ibrahim Traoré before that morning found themselves invested in his fate because they recognized that it was also their own. CNN's emergency newsroom in Atlanta broke into chaos. Producers shouted across the floor as feeds from West Africa poured in. Veteran anchor Christiane Amanpour's voice cracked as she went live, searching for historical parallels. A sitting African president, surrounded by U.S. troops, had challenged the American head of state to a debate. But the real battle played out on social media, where African voices drowned out Western narratives for the first time in digital history. 7-day challenge exploded across platforms, shared by millions who had never heard of Burkina Faso but understood the symbolism of David facing Goliath. Fatou Diop, a Senegalese influencer with 2 million followers, live-streamed from Dakar as protesters gathered outside the American embassy. Her commentary, delivered in fluid transitions between French, Wolof, and English, reached audiences CNN couldn't access. "They want to paint this as terrorism," she said, her phone camera capturing elderly women praying in front of embassy gates. "But where are the weapons? Where's the violence? I see only people defending their leader with prayers and songs." In Kenya, tech entrepreneur Samuel Njoroge watched Western news coverage with growing anger. Major networks focused on security concerns and regional stability, while barely mentioning the sovereignty violations. He made a decision that would amplify African voices globally. "Enough," he muttered, opening his laptop. Within 6 hours, he had launched AfricaReports.live, a streaming platform aggregating feeds from African journalists on the ground. By midnight, it was trending worldwide. The platform revealed what mainstream media missed. This wasn't just about one leader. Interviews with protesters showed deep frustration with decades of Western interference, economic exploitation, and cultural condescension. For the first time, global audiences heard Africans speak for themselves about their own continent. Dr. Wangari Maathai Jr., a political scientist at the University of Nairobi and daughter of the Nobel laureate, provided context Western outlets lacked. Speaking directly to African cameras, she explained what outsiders couldn't grasp. "You cannot understand this moment without understanding our history. Every African leader who has tried to control our resources independently has faced the same treatment. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. The pattern is clear." Deep inside Pentagon briefing rooms, General Patricia Hayes slammed her laptop shut as the secure video call from Ouagadougou dissolved into static. 6 months of planning were unraveling on live television. But the true crisis lay in the folders spread across her desk. Satellite photos confirmed massive lithium deposits under Burkina Faso, enough to power electric vehicles for a century. Traoré's government had already signed contracts with China and Russia, locking out U.S. corporations. His fiery speeches weren't just rhetoric. He was dismantling Western control over Africa's most valuable resources. Intelligence files on her desk exposed plans for a Pan-African mining consortium, one that would block American companies entirely. But the implications went far deeper than one nation's mineral wealth. If Traoré's resistance succeeded, other African leaders would follow suit. The entire architecture of resource extraction that had enriched Western corporations for decades could collapse. In a State Department bunker, Deputy Secretary Robert Thornton paced furiously as his narrative collapsed. Publicly, the line had been terrorism. Privately, reports showed Traoré's forces had eliminated more extremist cells in 2 years than a decade of Western intervention. His crime wasn't aiding terrorists. It was proving Africa didn't need American troops to solve African problems. The irony was devastating. Every success in fighting terrorism made him more dangerous to Western interests. A stable, self-sufficient Burkina Faso threatened the justification for American military presence across the Sahel. Across the Atlantic, James Crawford, CEO of Atlas Mining, stared at plummeting stock prices. He had once secured billion-dollar contracts with Burkina Faso's old regime for lithium extraction at prices that barely benefited local communities. Now, Traoré's new contracts with Asian partners paid 10 times more, with revenues staying in Africa. Documents on his desk proved the company had funded fabricated intelligence reports, painting Traoré as a threat. The more he succeeded at development and security, the more dangerous he became to Western profits. Financial markets reflected the deeper crisis. Shares in mining conglomerates across Africa dropped as investors realized the Burkina Faso model could spread. If other nations followed suit, demanding fair prices and local control, the entire colonial economic structure would crumble. In London, commodity traders watched their screens with growing panic. The Africa desks that had generated massive profits through artificially cheap resource deals now faced an existential threat. One successful resistance could inspire a continent. Back in Ouagadougou, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the palace compound, Traoré emerged from the ancestral chamber transformed. The meteoric amulet pulsed warm against his chest, connecting him to generations of leaders who had faced impossible odds with dignity intact. Elder Yamba's blessing still echoed in his mind. True power flows not from weapons or foreign approval, but from the unbreakable bond between a leader and his people. Standing at his office window, Traoré could see the crowd had grown beyond estimation. Helicopters circled overhead, some military, others carrying news crews broadcasting live to the world. The morning's quiet palace had become the center of global attention. Aminata approached with updates flooding in from across Africa. Mr. President, calls are coming from every capital. The AU chairman wants an emergency session. Presidents are making statements of support. She paused, checking her tablet. And, sir, the challenge is everywhere online. As U7 Day, challenge is trending in 50 countries. Traoré smiled grimly. The gauntlet he was about to throw wouldn't just challenge America. It would force the entire world to choose between the old order of interference and a new era of African sovereignty. He walked to his desk and picked up a single sheet of paper, blank except for the presidential seal. With steady hands, he began to write words that would echo through history. Directly in front of the lead vehicle, elderly women in bright head wraps sat in the dust, hands joined in prayer. Their faces carried the quiet strength of mothers who had already buried children in wars past. They showed no fear, only unshakable resolve. Behind them, teenagers raised their phones, broadcasting the confrontation live to a global audience. The mission his commanders had wanted hidden was now exposed for the world to see. Rodriguez's training had prepared him for rifles and barricades, not grandmothers singing lullabies to block his path. His finger hesitated over the radio button, realizing that to move forward meant laying hands on civilians who reminded him of his own grandmother back in Texas. From the balcony, President Traoré watched the uprising form with pride mixed with deep concern. Factory workers in colorful uniforms formed a semicircle around the gates, their bodies a living shield against the armored vehicles. School teachers stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers who still carried hoes from the fields, united in their refusal to surrender ground. The sight brought tears to his eyes, but also the crushing knowledge that one wrong step could turn courage into massacre. The sun climbed higher, casting shadows like long protective arms over the crowd. More people arrived on foot, in crowded taxis, and even on donkey carts. An entire nation was moving to defend its leader. The American soldiers stood trapped in an impossible position. They were trained for war, but not for civilians who fought with courage instead of weapons. Sergeant Williams, only 23, stared at a boy no older than his brother back home. The child gripped a small flag in one hand and a wilted flower in the other, offering both to the soldier with a smile that made Williams lower his weapon. Voices rose in harmony. The national anthem swept across the crowd in Mouré, French, and Dioula, a sound more powerful than any rifle, Firepower suddenly felt meaningless against people determined to die standing rather than live kneeling. Rodriguez's headset buzzed with panicked chatter from command, reports now flooding in as social media carried the standoff to every corner of the globe. Williams kept looking at the boy, wondering how he would explain this day to his own children if he survived it. Inside the palace, Traoré knelt on a woven mat before a small altar of shells and incense. The walls, built centuries ago, still carried the weight of kings who had faced their own impossible choices. Elder Yamba entered quietly, a pouch of sacred objects in his trembling hands. He laid a wooden mask upon the altar, its carved features flickering in candlelight. Outside, chants echoed like prayers riding on desert winds. Inside, the air filled with incense and red earth. "Your great-grandfather fought the French with only determination and the blessing of his ancestors," Yamba whispered. He drew patterns in the dust, symbols older than history itself. Traoré closed his eyes, feeling generations settle heavily upon his shoulders. Rising from the mat, Traoré felt the fear leave his body like water draining from a cracked vessel. The wooden mask caught the sun filtering through the window, its carved features almost smiling with approval. Elder Yamba placed the meteoric amulet in his palm, the fragment of fallen star that had guided Mosi kings for 5 centuries. "Your response must echo through history like the great speeches of our liberation heroes," the elder counseled, his voice steady with faith. Traoré nodded, understanding this moment would define not only his presidency, but Africa's future. The amulet pressed into his palm felt like a piece of fallen star, heavy with destiny. With clarity renewed, he walked from the chamber toward the waiting crowd. He carried with him the wisdom of ancestors who had never surrendered. Emerging from the palace doors, he moved with the stride of a man transformed. The roar of thousands thundered, but he lifted his hand, and silence fell. 10,000 voices hushed in unison, as if commanded by nature itself. In his left hand he carried a wooden staff of baobab. In his right, a microphone wired to speakers ready to carry his words across the land. His robe gleamed in the sunlight, white against the green uniforms of foreign troops. Captain Rodriguez adjusted his binoculars. He expected fear or defiance. Instead, he saw unsettling calm. The ancestral amulet pulsed warmly against Traoré's side, reminding him he stood with generations behind him. On the palace steps, Elder Yamba smiled faintly, sensing the ancient power flowing through his leader. "Captain Rodriguez," Traoré's voice carried across the compound, sharp and commanding, somehow knowing the commander's name without introduction. The sound rippled through the ranks of American soldiers who had braced for either surrender or violence, not personal recognition. "I know why you're here," the president continued, his English clear and deliberate. "And I know the orders you've been given by men who have never set foot on African soil." The crowd swayed like wheat bending with the wind, their breathing syncing with the cadence of his words. Rodriguez fumbled for his radio, uncertain whether to report or simply listen. Through his headset, superiors shouted for immediate action, but something in the young president's voice made him pause. The sun climbed higher, stretching Traoré's shadow long across the red earth. "But I have a counter-proposal," he announced, "one your Pentagon planners never imagined." From his robe, he drew not a weapon but a single sheet of paper. In the sunlight, it seemed almost to glow. "I challenge the President of the United States," Traoré declared, "to meet me here in Ouagadougou within 7 days, to debate the future of Africa before the entire world." The crowd erupted, cheers mixed with gasps of disbelief, while American soldiers shifted uneasily. Rodriguez's radio burst with panicked voices from command, desperate for confirmation. The paper in Traoré's hand fluttered in the wind, held steady like a flag of defiance. Even the stray dogs fell silent, as if history itself demanded attention. In Washington, D.C., the White House Situation Room exploded into chaos. National Security Advisor Rebecca Chen stared at multiple screens showing the live broadcast from Ouagadougou. The president was in Camp David, but emergency protocols had been activated. Did he just... She started, unable to finish the sentence. Challenge the President of the United States to a public debate, confirmed CIA Director Michael Torres, in Africa, on live television, with the whole world watching. The implications crashed over them like a tsunami. Accept the challenge and they legitimized a leader they had just labeled a terrorist. Refuse, and they looked weak. Bullying a small African nation rather than engaging in diplomatic discourse. Secretary of State Jennifer Morrison paced the room, her mind racing through possible responses. "We can't possibly—" "Actually," interrupted the legal counsel, "there's no precedent for refusing such a challenge, especially when it's being broadcast globally as an alternative to military confrontation." On screens across the room, they watched American soldiers frozen in an impossible position, facing thousands of unarmed civilians. Social media feeds showed a 7-day challenge exploding across platforms in dozens of languages. Rodriguez felt torn between his orders and an unexpected respect for the man he had been sent to arrest. The mission had shifted. No longer an extraction, but a moment that demanded diplomacy beyond his reach. Through his binoculars, he saw Traoré's eyes. Burning, resolute, fearless. The challenge hung in the air like sacred smoke, impossible to ignore, dangerous to acknowledge. Behind him, his communications officer scrambled to raise higher command, but static filled the line. The crowd's energy changed, from protective anger to breathless anticipation. They knew the rules of the game had just been rewritten. In that moment, both men understood. Whatever happened next would echo in history for generations. Rodriguez stared, torn between training and conscience. His radio buzzed with frantic voices from Washington, officials panicking as a carefully planned operation unraveled live before the world. Sweat ran down his forehead, not from the heat, but from the weight of impossible choices. Rodriguez's earpiece filled with louder commands, each more frantic than the last. "Extract him immediately," shouted one voice while another demanded restraint. Conflicting orders crackled through, exposing the confusion in Washington. Around him, the crowd swelled tighter. Children playing at the feet of their parents, completely unafraid. The soldiers shifted nervously, caught between rules of engagement and the humanity staring them in the face. 12 hours earlier, the instructions had been clear. Remove Traoré at any cost. Now, with CNN helicopters circling above and Al Jazeera broadcasting live from the gates, those orders felt like sand slipping through Rodriguez's hands. "Sir, what are our instructions?" whispered Sergeant Williams, his young voice betraying the same unease shared across the unit. Rodriguez had led tours in Afghanistan. But nothing in his experience prepared him for a leader who stood still, unarmed, and unbowed. The president's challenge had turned a military mission into a crisis spiraling far above their pay grades. Through the earpiece, arguments erupted between Pentagon brass and State Department officials, each shouting over the other. Meanwhile, the crowd's singing grew louder, voices blending in languages Rodriguez didn't understand but felt in his chest. His communications officer tapped his shoulder urgently, raising a satellite phone with a direct line to Washington. The blinking red light pulsed like a countdown. From his vantage, Rodriguez caught sight of an elderly woman in the crowd holding a faded photograph of her dead son. Tears streaked her face, mixing with pride that burned through grief. The captain's hand hovered near his earpiece. The chatter in his headset hit a fever pitch. Officials in Washington, realizing control was slipping, barked orders that contradicted one another. Rodriguez stared out at the scene spread before him. Flags on every rooftop, cameras from every news network, the eyes of the world on his next move. His training screamed, "Obey orders, complete the mission." His conscience whispered, "Some commands should never be followed." The satellite phone in his officer's hand blinked steadily, each flash heavier than the last. Rodriguez looked again toward the crowd. Mothers, children, elders, all standing with unshakable resolve. At last, he pulled the earpiece from his ear and dropped it into the red dust. His voice cut clear. "Stand down." Relief rippled across his unit. Weapons lowered. Sergeant Williams smiled for the first time all morning, nodding toward the crowd with respect. The satellite phone kept ringing, but Rodriguez turned away. He had chosen humanity over hierarchy. A career soldier had decided some battles are won only by refusing to fight. Across Africa, the story spread instantly. In Lagos, President Bola Tinubu was pulled from briefing by screens alive with images from Ouagadougou. His advisors stood in stunned silence, watching Traoré's challenge reverberate across the continent. Protests ignited outside U.S. embassies in a dozen capitals. Tinubu drafted a statement, his voice edged with fury. The violation of sovereignty would not stand. But it was the response of ordinary Africans that truly shook the world. In markets from Marrakech to Mombasa, vendors abandoned their stalls to gather around television screens. In villages without electricity, people huddled around battery-powered radios, translating the news into local languages. Traffic in Lagos froze. Drivers left their cars in the streets, staring at their phones. Everyone wanted to witness what would come next. In Nairobi, Kenyan students poured out of lecture halls at the University of Nairobi, their chants of solidarity rolling across campus like waves. Professor Wanjiku Mugwa stood at the doorway, watching her classroom empty. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues across Africa, each one sharing the same viral video of Traoré's defiance. The demonstrations weren't organized by politicians or activists. They emerged spontaneously from communities that had waited generations for this moment. In Accra's Makola market, traders who competed fiercely for customers suddenly stood united, sharing stories of colonial humiliation their grandparents had endured. On campus grounds, the sound of traditional drums echoed. Students from every ethnic group united behind one cause, something rare in recent years. Faces painted with the colors of Burkina Faso's flag, they marched toward the American embassy. News crews scrambled, chasing the story as it spread from university to university like wildfire. The professor allowed herself a grim smile. Her students were witnessing history firsthand, a moment that would reshape their understanding of African power. In Accra, Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo convened an emergency African Union session by secure video link. His voice trembled with restrained anger as he addressed fellow leaders. Translators worked furiously, carrying Traoré's words into Arabic, Swahili, and Portuguese. Within hours, statements of support poured in from Addis Ababa, Pretoria, and Dar es Salaam. Governments chose careful words, defending sovereignty without directly confronting American power. Yet the message was unmistakable. Africa was uniting. On the streets of Accra, market women shuttered their stalls early. They crowded around radios and televisions, debating every detail with animated voices. For many, it was the first time since independence celebrations that such excitement filled the air. From Cape Town to Cairo, the pattern repeated. Ordinary people dropped daily tasks to gather, to watch, to feel part of something larger. Students in South Africa painted murals of Traoré beside Mandela, while protesters in Cairo chanted his name in Tahrir Square. The international response revealed deeper fault lines than anyone expected. In Beijing, Chinese foreign ministry officials watched the crisis with strategic interest. If American military intervention in Africa faced this level of resistance, China's economic partnerships looked more attractive by comparison. President Xi Jinping convened his African Affairs Committee within hours. China had invested billions in African infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. A successful resistance to American interference could accelerate the continent's pivot toward Asian partnerships. "This changes everything," declared Foreign Minister Wang Yi. "African leaders will remember who stood with them and who pointed guns at their palaces." In Moscow, Vladimir Putin saw opportunity in American embarrassment. Russia had been building military and economic ties across Africa for years, often competing directly with U.S. interests. Traoré's challenge exposed American weakness in a region where Russian influence was growing. Russian state media immediately framed the confrontation as evidence of American imperialism, broadcasting Traoré's speech with Russian subtitles across their African service networks. RT Arabic and RT French carried live coverage with commentators explaining the historical parallels to Soviet support for African liberation movements. European responses were more complex. In Paris, President Emmanuel Macron faced a delicate balance. France had its own complicated history in Burkina Faso and across the Francophone Sahel. Supporting American intervention could inflame anti-French sentiment already simmering across former colonies. The Élysée Palace issued a carefully worded statement calling for dialogue and respect for sovereignty, diplomatic language that satisfied no one while avoiding commitment to either side. In London, the British Foreign Office struggled with similar constraints. Brexit had already complicated Britain's global positioning, and the special relationship with America conflicted with post-colonial guilt that still influenced African policy. Across the diaspora, rallies erupted in London, Paris, and New York. Elderly men who had lived through colonial rule sat in village squares nodding, while younger generations translated the news into local tongues. Africa's heartbeat synchronized around one moment of defiance. What truly terrified Western establishments wasn't the challenge itself, but how quickly African narratives dominated global discourse. For the first time in the digital age, African voices weren't waiting for Western media to tell their stories. In Lagos, tech entrepreneur Kemi Adebayo had spent years building streaming infrastructure across Africa. When Noerk 7-Day Challenge exploded online, her servers crashed from traffic. Within 6 hours, she had mobilized every developer in her network to create mirror sites, ensuring African voices couldn't be silenced by technical failures. "They control CNN and BBC," she told her exhausted team as they worked through the night. "But they don't control our phones, our internet, our truth." Her platform, Africa Streams, became the primary source for unfiltered coverage. Street interviews in Dakar revealed frustrations that Reuters never captured. Live feeds from university campuses showed solidarity that AP photographers missed. For the first time, the world heard Africa speak for itself. Dr. Amina Hassan, a media studies professor at Cairo University, watched the phenomenon with academic fascination. "This is more than news coverage," she explained to Al Jazeera. "This is narrative warfare. For centuries, others have told our stories. Today, we're taking back the microphone." The contrast was stark. CNN focused on security implications and regional stability. African streamers interviewed grandmothers who remembered independence celebrations, children who painted their faces with flag colors, and young professionals who saw Traoré as their generation's Mandela. BBC World Service tried to maintain neutrality but faced pressure from their own African correspondents. Journalists born in Lagos, Nairobi, and Accra found themselves explaining context their London editors couldn't grasp. "You can't understand this without understanding Sankara," insisted BBC Africa correspondent Sarah Kwaku during a heated editorial meeting. "Without understanding what happened to Lumumba, to Nkrumah, to every African leader who dared to control their own resources." Her editors, mostly white and London-based, struggled to comprehend the historical weight African audiences felt watching armored vehicles surround an African palace. To them, it was breaking news. To Africans, it was repetition of a centuries-old pattern. Financial markets reflected deeper anxieties than stock prices revealed. In London's financial district, Commodity traders who had built careers on African resource extraction watched their models collapse in real time. Marcus Henderson, a senior analyst at Barclays who specialized in African mining stocks, stared at his screens with growing alarm. Since Traoré's challenge, shares in every major Western mining company with African operations had tumbled. "It's not just Burkina Faso," he explained to increasingly panicked clients. "If this spreads, if other African leaders start demanding fair prices and local control, the entire sector restructures overnight." The implications went beyond mining. Agricultural contracts, oil extraction deals, infrastructure projects, the entire colonial economic model depended on African leaders who prioritized foreign approval over local benefit. In Johannesburg, the continent's financial capital, a different story emerged. Local markets surged as investors realized African resistance could mean African opportunity. Companies with purely continental focus saw their valuations soar. Thabo Mthembu, CEO of Ubuntu Financial, watched his firm's African-focused investment funds attract unprecedented interest. "International money is scared," he told CNBC Africa, "but African money sees opportunity. If we're going to control our resources, we need African capital markets strong enough to support African development." The shift was psychological as much as economic. For decades, African leaders had worried about scaring away foreign investment. Traoré's example suggested the opposite. Real prosperity might require scaring away foreign exploitation. In Washington, the crisis had moved far beyond military strategy into existential questions about American global leadership. The Situation Room had become a war room, but the enemy wasn't a traditional military force. It was a narrative America couldn't control. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin paced before wall-mounted screens showing protests outside U.S. embassies in 47 countries. This wasn't limited to Africa anymore. Solidarity demonstrations had erupted in South America, Asia, and even European capitals where immigrant communities felt kinship with Burkina Faso's resistance. "Sir," reported General Hayes, "we're getting pushback from our own allies. Germany and France are suggesting we de-escalate. Even the UK is maintaining diplomatic distance." President Biden, participating via secure video from Camp David, looked older than his years. The man who had campaigned on restoring American leadership abroad now faced a crisis that exposed the limits of that leadership. "What are our options?" he asked, though the question felt rhetorical. "Militarily, we could proceed with the extraction," Austin replied carefully, "but the optical costs would be devastating. Moving against unarmed civilians would make us look like the colonizers they're calling us," finished Secretary of State Blinken. CIA Director Burns spread classified assessments across the table. "Our intelligence suggests this isn't spontaneous. Chinese and Russian operatives are amplifying the narrative, turning this into a proxy confrontation." "Or," interjected National Security Advisor Sullivan, "maybe 50 African nations are genuinely angry that we surrounded their colleagues' palace with tanks." The room fell silent. In decades of foreign policy experience, none had faced a situation where American military supremacy felt more like liability than asset. "What about the debate?" asked Biden finally. "Do we respond to his challenge?" The question hung in the air like toxic gas. Accept, and they legitimized a leader they had labeled a terrorist while subjecting American policy to public scrutiny. Refuse, and they confirmed every accusation of imperialism echoing across global media. Back in Ouagadougou, as the sun reached its zenith, something unprecedented happened. Captain Rodriguez climbed down from his vehicle. He removed his helmet, his empty hands raised. The crowd parted in silence, forming a corridor as he walked slowly toward the palace gates. His men watched in disbelief as their commander crossed the invisible line between occupier and guest. The symbolism was electric. An American soldier, sent to arrest an African president, was instead approaching as a supplicant. Phones captured every step, broadcasting the moment to audiences that had waited lifetimes to see Western power bend. 10 feet from Traoré, Rodriguez stopped. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. President," Rodriguez said in steady English, his words carrying across the compound, "my government sent me to arrest you. But I cannot arrest a man whose only crime is loving his country." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Cheers and tears mixed as they watched an American soldier choose conscience over command. Rodriguez turned to his men and gave the order that would echo through military academies for generations. "Stand back. Form a perimeter." In a twist none could have imagined, American troops became guardians of the very leader they had come to capture. Sergeant Williams stepped forward first, lowering his weapon completely. One by one, his unit followed suit. Soldiers who had trained for urban warfare found themselves protecting a peaceful gathering of families and children. The transformation was profound. Fear left the crowd, replaced by celebration. Children who had cowered behind their parents now approached the soldiers with curious smiles. Mothers offered water to young Americans sweating in heavy gear designed for combat, not diplomacy. Rodriguez's radio crackled with increasingly frantic demands from Washington, but he had moved beyond their reach. His decision represented something larger than military insubordination. It was a declaration that some human bonds transcend national orders. "Sir," his communications officer whispered, "command is demanding immediate response." Rodriguez looked at the officer, barely 22, probably enlisted to pay for college, now caught between career preservation and moral clarity. "Tell them," he said loud enough for nearby reporters to hear, "that the mission has changed. We're keeping the peace, not disrupting it." As news of the stand-down spread, celebrations erupted from Dar es Salaam to Dakar. In Washington, politicians scrambled to distance themselves from an operation that had gone spectacularly wrong. In newsrooms worldwide, editors rewrote headlines as the story shifted from military intervention to diplomatic revolution. President Macky Sall of Senegal, speaking from Dakar, became the first sitting African leader to explicitly endorse Traoré's challenge. "Africa calls upon President Biden to accept this invitation to dialogue," he declared. "Let the world witness a conversation between equals, not the barrel of guns pointed at our sovereignty." His statement opened floodgates. Within hours, 37 African leaders had issued similar endorsements. The African Union Emergency Session, initially called to discuss crisis management, transformed into a rally for continental unity. In New York, the UN Security Council convened an emergency session, but the usual power dynamics felt obsolete. African representatives spoke with unprecedented boldness, backed by global public opinion that favored the David in this geopolitical confrontation with Goliath. Ambassador Aisha Laraba Abdullahi of Nigeria addressed the chamber with controlled fury. "For too long, this body has watched silently as powerful nations treat African sovereignty as negotiable. Today, we demand answers. By what authority do American soldiers surround the home of a democratically elected African president?" The American representative, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, struggled to respond within diplomatic protocols that hadn't anticipated such direct challenges. Her carefully prepared talking points about terrorism and regional security felt hollow against images of children playing at soldiers' feet. Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia seized the moment, calling for formal condemnation of American military aggression. Chinese Ambassador Zhang Jun supported the motion, framing the crisis as evidence of Western double standards on international law. The vote was closer than anyone expected: 9 in favor of condemning the intervention, 3 opposed, 3 abstentions. While short of the majority needed for formal action, the symbolic victory resonated globally. 6 days after Traoré's challenge, as the deadline approached with no official American response, Something unprecedented happened. President Biden appeared in the White House briefing room, flanked by advisors who looked like they hadn't slept in a week. "The United States," he began, his voice carrying the weight of diminished superpower status, "has always believed in the power of dialogue over force. In that spirit, I am accepting President Traoré's invitation to discuss Africa's future in Ouagadougou." The announcement sent shockwaves through the Washington establishment. Conservative commentators called it capitulation to a terrorist. Progressive voices praised it as overdue recognition of African sovereignty. International reactions were mixed but generally positive. Even allies who had privately criticized the intervention welcomed this diplomatic alternative. But the real victory celebration happened in Ouagadougou's streets. When news of Biden's acceptance reached the crowd still surrounding the palace, the roar could be heard for miles. Drums that had beaten for 6 days now thundered in triumph. Children who had slept in the dust rather than abandon their president danced with joy. Elder Yamba, watching from the palace steps, smiled with satisfaction. The ancestors had kept their promise. The amulet around Traoré's neck pulsed with warmth as he stood before his people, no longer a president under siege but a leader who had forced the world's most powerful nation to acknowledge African dignity. 1 week later, Ouagadougou hosted the most watched political event in African history, the debate venue. The same palace courtyard where American soldiers had once aimed weapons was transformed into an open-air forum surrounded by traditional African art and symbols of pre-colonial kingdoms. President Biden arrived with a massive security detail and the subdued demeanor of a leader who had lost narrative control. President Traoré, wearing traditional mossy royal robes, carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already won the most important victory. The moderator was Dr. Wole Oguntoyinbo, former BBC correspondent and current director of the African Media Institute. His first question cut straight to the heart of the crisis. "President Biden, by what authority did the United States deploy military forces to arrest a democratically elected African president?" Biden's response, carefully crafted by teams of advisors, focused on terrorism concerns and regional security partnerships. But under Traoré's methodical cross-examination, the official narrative crumbled. "Mr. President," Traoré interjected, "your own intelligence agencies confirm that my government has eliminated more terrorist cells in 2 years than 20 years of Western intervention accomplished. If fighting terrorism was truly your goal, wouldn't you support, rather than undermine, effective African leadership?" The exchange was devastating. Biden, accustomed to friendly American media, found himself facing questions that exposed the contradictions in American Africa policy. Every answer about democracy and human rights was met with specific examples of American support for African dictators who served Western economic interests. The global audience was massive. Over 2 billion viewers across 6 continents. In Africa, entire cities stopped to watch. In Asia and Latin America, viewers saw parallels to their own experiences with Western interference. Even in Europe and North America, many viewers found themselves sympathizing with the African perspective they were hearing clearly for the first time. The most powerful moment came when Traoré produced documents, obtained through Chinese intelligence networks, proving American mining companies had funded the fabricated terrorism allegations. The papers, spread across the debate table for cameras to capture, showed a clear conspiracy to remove a leader whose crime was demanding fair prices for his nation's resources. Biden's team had prepared for many scenarios, but not for classified American documents being presented as evidence of corporate conspiracy. The president's stammered denials looked weak against documentary proof of what many Africans had long suspected. 6 months later, Traoré stood before the new Pan-African Mining Consortium headquarters in Ouagadougou. Solar panels glistened above, a beacon of independence blending tradition with modern design. Inside, representatives from 37 nations gathered to sign agreements that would forever reshape Africa's role in global markets. The building itself was symbolic. Designed by African architects using African materials, powered by African solar technology, it represented the continent's determination to control its own narrative. No longer would Africa's resources flow through European or American corporations at artificial prices. Minerals, once stripped for pennies, now flowed through African-controlled channels. Buyers from Asia and Europe paid fair prices. Local communities received direct benefits from extraction on their lands. Environmental protections, enforced by African agencies, ensured sustainable development rather than exploitative strip mining. At the back of the hall, Captain Rodriguez, retired from the U.S. Army, now working as a security consultant for the African Union, watched in quiet pride. His decision to stand down in Ouagadougou had cost him his military career but gained him something more valuable, the respect of a continent and peace with his conscience. Elder Yamba, frail but alive, had lived to see prophecies fulfilled. The meteoric amulet, now displayed in the headquarters cultural center, had guided another generation through crisis to prosperity. The 7-day challenge, unanswered initially by Washington but eventually accepted under global pressure, had become a rallying cry. Students across the continent launched annual celebrations that turned into yearly festivals of pride and self-determination. Online, the hashtag #Chiush7day challenge spread like wildfire, uniting millions in digital solidarity whenever African sovereignty faced threats. Universities established courses studying the Ouagadougou model of resistance through dignity rather than violence. Military academies analyzed Rodriguez's moral courage as an example of when soldiers must choose humanity over orders. Business schools examined how economic nationalism could coexist with global trade when built on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Across the continent, governments restructured their relationships with foreign powers. The African Union drafted new protocols requiring members to consult one another before signing resource deals with external partners. Presidents who had once competed for Western approval now competed to demonstrate independence and African pride. Ghana renegotiated its gold mining contracts, ensuring majority Ghanaian ownership and environmental oversight. Nigeria restructured oil deals to keep more revenue on the continent while funding education and infrastructure. Kenya launched its own space program using locally trained engineers rather than depending on foreign expertise. From Lagos to Nairobi, startups emerged with one focus: African solutions to African problems. Entrepreneurs who had once sought a Silicon Valley investment now looked to African capital markets and continental partnerships. Universities that had sent their brightest students to Western schools now built programs attractive enough to keep talent at home. The psychological transformation was as important as the economic changes. Children who had grown up seeing Western approval as the ultimate validation now learned African history with pride. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize pre-colonial achievements, independence heroes, and contemporary African innovations. Languages long suppressed by colonial education systems experienced revivals. Swahili expanded beyond East Africa as a symbol of Pan-African identity. Local languages were preserved and celebrated rather than abandoned for colonial tongues. France's CFA franc system, which had maintained economic control over former colonies for decades, came under sustained attack from nations emboldened by Burkina Faso's example. One by one, Francophone countries abandoned the currency that tied their monetary policy to European interests. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund found their structural adjustment programs rejected by governments that no longer feared Western disapproval. Instead, African countries formed their own financial institutions, lending to each other for infrastructure and development projects designed by Africans for African needs. The changes weren't limited to Africa. Traoré's example inspired resistance movements across the global South. Latin American countries facing U.S. pressure remembered Ouagadougou when negotiating trade deals. Asian nations challenged Western narratives about democracy and development, pointing to African examples of alternative governance models. Indigenous communities worldwide found inspiration in the way African traditions had been weaponized against modern imperialism. From Canadian First Nations to Australian Aboriginals, traditional leaders incorporated lessons from Elder Yamba's spiritual resistance into their own struggles for sovereignty. The global supply chain fundamentally shifted. Africa no longer sold itself cheaply to Western manufacturers. Instead, it set fair prices and demanded technology transfer, ensuring that resource wealth translated into long-term development rather than short-term extraction. Environmental protection strengthened as African governments prioritized sustainability over quick profits. Mining companies that had once operated with minimal oversight now faced rigorous environmental impact requirements enforced by African agencies accountable to African communities. Climate change mitigation accelerated as Africa's vast solar and wind potential was harnessed by African companies for African development. Instead of exporting raw materials to be processed elsewhere, the continent built its own clean energy manufacturing capabilities. Rodriguez's story became a case study in moral courage taught in military academies worldwide. His memoirs, Choosing Conscience, A Soldier's Duty to Humanity, became required reading for officers facing ethical dilemmas in complex global environments. He established a foundation providing educational scholarships for African students, funded partly by speaking fees from lectures about the day he chose to disobey orders. Veterans struggling with moral injury from questionable missions found healing in his example of redemption through right action. Sergeant Williams returned to Michigan a changed man. He left the military to become a social worker, dedicating his life to helping refugee families. Many from African conflicts he better understood after Ouagadougou. The boy who had offered him a flower in the dust haunted his dreams until he found purpose in service to vulnerable communities. Dr. Wanjiku Mugwa, the Kenyan professor who had watched her students empty her classroom to march for Traoré, established the Institute for African Narrative Studies. Her research documented how African voices were reclaiming their stories from Western interpreters, analyzing the Ouagadougou moment as a turning point in global information warfare. Mama Fatou, the weathered vendor who had led women banging pots in resistance, became an unlikely international symbol. Her image, silver-haired, defiant, facing down armored vehicles with nothing but dignity, appeared on murals from Harlem to Johannesburg. She used her newfound fame to establish women's cooperatives across West Africa, teaching younger generations how economic independence could serve political resistance. Her motto, painted on cooperative buildings across the Sahel, was simple: they cannot break what they do not own. 5 years after the 7-day challenge, Ouagadougou had become a pilgrimage site for Africans and supporters of African liberation worldwide. The palace courtyard where Traoré had faced down American soldiers was preserved as a monument to dignity overcoming force. Tour guides, many of them children who had sat in the dust during those critical days, told visitors about the moment their continent stopped apologizing for its existence. The museum, built on the site, included recordings of Elder Yamba's prayers, Rodriguez's testimony about moral courage, and testimonies from ordinary Burkinabe who had chosen to stand with their leader. The economic transformation was measurable in concrete statistics. African GDP grew at unprecedented rates as resource wealth stayed on the continent. Educational enrollment expanded as governments had funds for schools rather than debt service. Healthcare improved as mining revenues funded hospitals rather than foreign bank accounts. Child mortality rates plummeted. Literacy rates soared. Infrastructure development accelerated as African engineering firms completed projects once dominated by Chinese or European companies. The brain drain that had sent Africa's brightest minds to Western universities reversed, as continental institutions offered opportunities that rivaled global alternatives. Political changes were equally dramatic. The African Union evolved from a largely ceremonial organization into an effective continental government. Disputes between member nations were resolved through African mediation rather than external intervention. The Union's peacekeeping forces, trained by African military academies and accountable to African populations, proved more effective than foreign interventions at maintaining stability. Democracy strengthened rather than weakened as leaders focused on African approval rather than Western validation. Elections were monitored by African observers who understood local contexts better than European or American teams. Corruption decreased as governments were accountable to citizens who had tasted the power of collective action. Traoré walked the streets of Ouagadougou as children ran alongside him, their laughter bouncing off new research centers and local factories. He had kept his promise: transformation without losing the nation's soul. The president, who had once stood alone against impossible odds, now moved, surrounded by the affection of a continent that had found its voice. Students from across Africa came to study at the Thomas Sankara University, built with mining revenues on land once occupied by foreign military bases. Markets that once emptied in fear now thrived with African goods manufactured by African workers for African consumers. The informal economy that had survived centuries of exploitation now operated as cooperatives owning their means of production. Traditional healers worked alongside modern doctors in clinics that blended indigenous knowledge with contemporary medicine. Languages once forbidden in schools were now taught alongside French and English as equal partners in multicultural education. The baobab tree that had seemed to lean protectively over the palace during the crisis had become a symbol appearing on the new continental currency. Its roots, spreading deep and wide, represented African connections that couldn't be severed by external pressure. Elder Yamba had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after the challenge, surrounded by family and disciples who would carry traditional wisdom into the modern age. His funeral became a celebration attended by leaders from across the continent, all of whom credited his spiritual guidance for Traoré's moral clarity during the crucial moment. The meteoric amulet he had passed to Traoré was enshrined in the African Heritage Center, where visitors from around the world came to understand how ancient wisdom had guided modern resistance. School children on field trips learned that their ancestors' strength lived within them, waiting for moments that demanded courage. Rodriguez, now in his 50s, returned to Ouagadougou every year on the anniversary of his decision to stand down. Each visit reminded him that some choices transcend career considerations and national loyalties. He had lost his military pension, but gained something more valuable: the respect of his children, who grew up knowing their father had chosen right over easy. His foundation had grown into a continental network supporting African students in engineering, medicine, and technology. Many graduates stayed in Africa to build the infrastructure of independence, while others who studied abroad returned with skills their continent needed. The palace, once surrounded by foreign troops, now welcomed delegations eager to learn how one small nation had reshaped continental relations with global powers. Trade missions from Asia, Europe, and Latin America came seeking partnerships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Tour groups included former American soldiers who had served in Africa and wanted to understand what they had been part of. Many left with changed perspectives on American foreign policy and their own roles in implementing it. Elder Yamba's prophecy had proven true. The ancestors had not abandoned their descendants. The spiritual resistance he had channeled through Traoré became a model for indigenous communities worldwide facing modernization without losing cultural identity. The new dawn belonged to Africa's children, inheritors of sovereignty no longer treated as privilege but defended as birthright. They learned traditional stories alongside quantum physics, spoke ancestral languages while coding in Python, and saw no contradiction between honoring the past and building the future. Traoré's 7-day challenge proved a truth no weapon could silence. Real power rests not in armies, but in conviction and the unbreakable bond between leader and people. His defiance ignited a continental awakening that forever altered Africa's destiny. The moment an African president stood unarmed before American tanks and emerged victorious became a reference point for every subsequent struggle for dignity and self-determination. The story spread beyond Africa to inspire resistance movements on every continent. Indigenous leaders facing extractive industries pointed to Ouagadougou as proof that David could still defeat Goliath. Environmental activists blocking pipelines invoked the image of grandmothers praying in front of armored vehicles. Students studying international relations learned that the Westphalian system of nation-states was evolving, with new models of sovereignty emerging from the global South. The Ouagadougou Protocols became standard reference points for negotiations between former colonial powers and their former colonies. Military academies worldwide taught Rodriguez's decision as an example of how soldiers must navigate moral complexity in modern conflicts. His testimony before Congress about the day he chose humanity over hierarchy became required viewing for officer candidates. The economic models developed through the Pan-African Mining Consortium influenced resource-rich countries across the global South. The principle that natural wealth should benefit local populations rather than foreign shareholders spread from Africa to Latin America to Southeast Asia. As the narrator's voice faded and the screen dimmed, the final images showed children in Ouagadougou playing in parks built with mining revenues, their laughter echoing off buildings designed by African architects using African materials, powered by African solar panels, representing a future their grandparents had dreamed but never dared hope to see. "What do you think of this story?" the narrator asked as the screen dimmed completely. Subscribe for more inspiring African leadership tales that show how courage can reshape the world, and share your thoughts below about how one person's refusal to surrender can change the destiny of an entire continent. The 7-day challenge had ended, but its legacy would echo through generations yet unborn, reminding them that dignity cannot be conquered, sovereignty cannot be granted by others, and the bond between a leader and people who trust each other can move mountains, or in this case, move the most powerful military in history to choose peace over conquest. The revolution was complete. Africa had found its voice, and the world would never be the same.